The HOA thought they could intimidate my wife because she didn't want to join the association. They arrested her, threatened her, and tried to show her who was boss, until they found out that she was a retired delegate. Moving to a new house should be exciting, right? A fresh start, a quiet neighborhood, that feeling of finally finding the perfect home. But there's a detail that no one tells you when you buy a house near an HOA. Sometimes, these neighborhood groups are less of a neighborhood association and more of a cult with an authority complex. My wife and I moved into a spacious house, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. A quiet place, with clean streets, well-kept yards, and, apparently, decent neighbors. But the problem started as soon as we signed the papers. The HOA in that area was one of those who think they're in charge of everything. And the woman in charge? Well, if there were an army of HOA presidents, she would be the supreme general. This woman exuded that energy of someone who wakes up in the morning thinking, "How can I make someone's life hell today?" Within the first week, they came to the door trying to recruit us. We politely refused. We didn't buy a house within the HOA's jurisdiction. The previous owner never wanted to join, so legally, we weren't obliged to either. But apparently, the word no didn't exist in that woman's dictionary. The letters started to arrive. First, it was just a friendly invitation to join the association. Then came the recommendations on how we could improve the facade of our house. And when we ignored that, the letters turned into veiled threats, talking about community standards, consequences for those who don't cooperate, and all that claptrap. My wife laughed at every one of these letters. She's not just any woman. She spent decades dealing with criminals, troublemakers, and idiots who thought they could intimidate her. But these clowns from the HOA? Those were just a minor nuisance compared to what she'd already faced in her life. After a few weeks of ignoring the attacks, the HOA upped the ante. Now they were trying to force us to pay fines. Fines. For not cutting the grass to the exact height they wanted. For not having a mailbox up to the standards of the association. For keeping a car in the garage that, according to them, didn't fit in with the aesthetics of the neighborhood. It was funny. Really funny. Because we weren't members of the HOA, which meant that these fines were as legitimate as a $3 bill. So we tore them all up. And that's when it got ugly. One evening, on our way home from dinner, we noticed something strange. My wife's wheelchair access ramp had been removed. Now, for those who don't know, my wife uses a wheelchair to get around. Not because she's frail or helpless. In fact, she's tougher than anyone I know. But still, to take away the one thing that allows her to get in and out of the house with ease? That wasn't just an attack. It was a declaration of war. And if the HOA wanted a fight, they were about to learn what happens when they poke the wrong person. Finding out that someone had removed my wife's access ramp was that kind of moment when your blood boils immediately. The kind of fury that doesn't come gradually. It explodes inside you, instantly. But my wife? Oh, she didn't get angry in the way I expected. She smiled. Yes, she did. That woman spent years dealing with real criminals, real dangerous people. And now a bunch of yard inspectors thought they could intimidate her? They had no idea how much trouble they were in. But before we could hit back, we needed proof. We did what any smart person would do. We looked at the security cameras. And there it was. 2 in the morning. 3 figures, all in black, appeared in front of the house. They ripped out the ramp with tools, made sure there were no cameras nearby, they made a big mistake there, and disappeared into the night. The icing on the cake? The HOA left a letter in our mailbox the next morning, informing us that structures not approved by the association should be removed to maintain the aesthetics of the community. It was obvious. It wasn't a mistake. They did it on purpose. Now, at that point, any reasonable person would call the police. But my wife is not just anyone. She picked up the phone and made a call, but not to the police. She called an old friend. Meanwhile, the HOA continued on its ridiculous crusade to force us into the association. they started harassing the neighbors, saying that we were a problem for the community. One of them even had the audacity to knock on our door the next day. Maybe if you'd just reconsider. Before the idiot could finish his sentence, my wife slammed the door in his face. And then the HOA escalated to the most absurd level possible. 2 days later, we left the house for an appointment. When we returned, we found my wife chained to a tree in our own backyard. Chained, with a real metal chain, as if it were a warning, an example for the rest of the neighborhood. And the HOA? It was standing on the sidewalk, as if they had done something great, as if they expected her to cry, to beg, or to become just another obedient citizen of their dictatorship. But she didn't scream. She didn't cry. She laughed. A low, slow laugh. The kind of laugh that doesn't come from someone scared, but from someone who knows they've won before the game has even begun. And that's when she looked at the woman from the HOA and said, without a trace of concern, "You've really screwed over the wrong person." And for the first time, the HOA president looked nervous. My wife was tied to a damn tree in her own backyard, as if she were being punished for a crime she didn't commit. And the HOA? Well, they were there, proud, with those smiles of people who think they've done something incredible, as if they had won, as if that was going to teach us a lesson. But they forgot one little detail. My wife wasn't the type of person to be intimidated. She wasn't the kind of person who cries and takes it in her stride. And, most importantly, she wasn't just some housewife trying to live in peace. She was a retired delegate, and that meant that the HOA had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. But before I get to that, let me tell you what happened before the situation exploded for good. As soon as I saw my wife trapped in there, I ran over to her to try to get her out. But before I could even touch the chain, she shook her head and stopped me. "Let them sink in a bit more," she said, with a mischievous smile. She wasn't worried at all. She wanted them to think they'd won. And that's exactly what happened. The president of the HOA, let's call her the HOA Queen, took a step forward, crossed her arms and opened her mouth to spout some drivel about obeying community rules and learning to follow guidelines. But before she could finish her sermon, sirens began to sound. And it wasn't just one car. There were 4, lights flashing, tires singing on the asphalt, as if we were about to witness a SWAT operation. And the best part? My wife didn't even blink. The police cars pulled up in our street, and who got out of the first vehicle was an old acquaintance of my wife's, the local police captain. And what did he see? A former deputy, a woman who spent years protecting citizens and arresting criminals, chained up in her own backyard because a bunch of HOA assholes decided to play sheriff. The look on his face was priceless. He looked at my wife, he looked at the chain, he looked at the HOA Queen, and then he laughed. Not a friendly laugh, a disbelieving laugh. The kind of laugh that says, "You're the biggest assholes I've ever seen in my life." And then he looked directly at the HOA Queen and said something that made the color drain from her face. "Do you have any idea how big a mess you've just gotten yourselves into?" The woman opened her mouth to try to justify herself, but he held up his hand, telling her to shut up on the spot. "If anyone here says anything other than an apology, I swear they'll leave here in handcuffs." Well, I leaned back in the car and enjoyed the show, because at that moment, the HOA realized that it had chosen the worst possible person to mess with. The president tried to argue, to say that it was no big deal, that it was just a symbolic way of reinforcing the rules of the community. But the captain didn't buy that excuse for a second. He pointed at the chain and said, in the most disgusted voice I've ever heard, "This here? That's private imprisonment." And then he got on the radio and called for more cars. Now the HOA Queen started to panic. She tried to say that it was all a misunderstanding, that it was nothing serious, that my wife could have left whenever she wanted, which was a lie, since they had padlocked the chain. But it was too late. The police were no longer there to talk. They were there to arrest people, and when I saw the police approaching the HOA queen with handcuffs in hand, my soul was washed clean. And the best part? My wife remained calm. She looked at the president and just smiled. And it was at that moment that the HOA queen finally realized who was really in charge. The HOA queen, who until a few minutes ago had been full of herself, was now shaking like a leaf in the wind. She tried to argue. She tried to get off track. She tried to use her usual authoritarian tone, but no one there was willing to listen anymore. When a policeman takes the handcuffs off his belt, you know the conversation is over. And then it happened. Click. The metallic sound of the handcuffs closing around the HOA queen's wrists. "You're under arrest for private imprisonment and harassment," said the captain, his voice bored, as if he were arresting someone for being too stupid. Well, I just watched from the sidelines, trying not to laugh. My wife was finally released, and the captain asked her if she wanted to sue the HOA and everyone involved. She didn't answer right away. She just rubbed her wrists where the chains had been and looked directly at the HOA queen, who now looked like she was about to cry. And then she smiled. A quiet smile, but one that said it all. "Let's see how she likes being locked up now," said my wife. The police took the HOA queen away, while the other members of the association looked on, terrified, realizing that maybe it was a good time to reconsider their life choices. But the story didn't end there. The neighbors heard all about it, and if there's one thing the HOA can't survive, it's public opinion. The news that the great and feared president of the HOA had been arrested for imprisoning a wheelchair user spread faster than beauty parlor gossip. It didn't take long for every resident of the neighborhood to hear about the shame that the HOA had caused the community. It was the talk of the town in every corner of the neighborhood. The next day, when I went out for a walk, I noticed that the mood was different. I saw neighbors talking in whispers, discreetly pointing at the president's house. The disapproving looks weren't just for her, but for all the HOA members who had allowed the situation to reach this point. Some of them avoided leaving the house. Others tried to justify themselves by saying that they hadn't agreed with the president's attitude, but it was too late. The association's image had already been completely tarnished. 2 days later, formal requests for the removal of the entire HOA board began to emerge. Residents who previously hadn't cared began to mobilize, demanding change. Documents were filed, signatures collected. Groups in the neighborhood began organizing to put an end to the association's tyranny. The HOA tried to fight back, arguing that it had all been a misunderstanding, that the president had acted alone, and that the organization should not be held responsible. But no one believed them. The lame excuses only increased the residents' indignation. A week later, what nobody expected happened. A special vote was organized by the residents themselves. It was an unprecedented event. People who had never attended HOA meetings showed up in droves to vote. The result was almost unanimous. The HOA was dissolved. Yes, completely dissolved. The power that small elite had over the neighborhood simply ceased to exist. The HOA queen lost everything. Without the support of the association, she was left without her throne. The status she loved so much disappeared. Her house was put up for sale in less than a month. They say she tried to move to another neighborhood with HOA. But after this story went viral, no other association wanted her as president. It was as if she had been banished from the world of HOAs. Her reputation was ruined. And my wife? She went on with her life as if nothing had happened. She carried on with her work, her routine, unperturbed. She never needed HOA approval. And now, without the association, the neighborhood has become a much quieter place to live. Her access ramp is still there, strong and firm, a symbol of resistance against the abuse of power. The neighbors have changed, too. With the end of the HOA, the community started to come together more. People began to solve problems among themselves, without the need for a controlling entity. Parties and community events sprang up, with no absurd rules to prevent everyone from enjoying them. For the first time in a long time, the neighborhood really felt like a welcoming home. In the end, justice was done, not just for my wife, but for all the residents who, for so long, had suffered under the tyranny of the HOA. The president's arrogance ended up being her undoing, and nothing could be more satisfying than to see the neighborhood free of this burden. And if you liked this video, don't forget to leave a like and a comment.